With vaccination picking up steam, the United States could have a third one approved soon. Food and Drug Administration advisors are meeting today to review the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. Initial data reveals it has met requirements for emergency use authorization. Joining us now for his views on vaccines and what steps are for their approval, we have former US FDA Associate Commissioner Peter Pitts joining us from New York. Professor, thank you so much for joining us. What do you know about the J&J COVID-19 vaccine that the US FDA would give it an EUA?
Well, an EUA, or emergency use authorization, I believe will be granted to the Johnson & Johnson vaccine because initially the data is very robust and sound. It's a very exciting vaccine because unlike the Moderna and Pfizer-BioNTech vaccines, it's a single dose. So that obviously has significant consequences for compliance and ease. It also does not need to be refrigerated at such high temperature, so it can be stored in other places such as pharmacies, so people have greater access to it. Its efficacy is 66% against the 95% for Pfizer and Moderna. But it's important to remember that when it comes to vaccine effectiveness rates, it's not like grades in school where a 66 is a C and a 95 is an A. Really, anything above 60 is an A. So I think the American public is going to have great faith in this vaccine. It's a great addition to the COVID-19 armamentarium, and I believe it will have great success all around the world as well.
But Professor, it's also quite important that the US FDA takes into account a vaccine's efficacy on these new variants that are coming from the UK and South Africa.
Yes, in fact, there are a number of variants, not just from Britain and from South Africa, from other places as well. And the Johnson & Johnson vaccine seems to be quite effective against the variation coming out of the UK and South Africa. So that's good news. And there's also, by the way, ongoing research into the other approved vaccines, or rather the vaccines available through EUA in the US relative to the variants. And it's good news. And these companies are also developing booster shots that will specifically target these variants. So it's an ongoing proposition.
But the bottom line, Professor Pitts, with these vaccines, severe COVID and deaths are the main things you want to protect against.
That's crucially important. And as with Pfizer and Moderna, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine absolutely protects people from severe manifestations of COVID-19. And that's crucially important across the population, but certainly for those most at risk, most especially the elderly, healthcare workers, and teachers, those most at risk for finding themselves in front of people that might have COVID-19. So good news across the board there.
All right. Backtracking from your experience, Professor Pitts, what is the track record of Johnson & Johnson in terms of vaccines and vaccine efficacy?
Johnson & Johnson has an excellent record across the whole spectrum of healthcare products, including vaccines. So I believe that obviously the name Johnson & Johnson in the US is an extremely trusted name. So in addition to a single dose vaccine that gets the job done, I think it will help to combat vaccine skepticism with a certain portion of the US population, and that's important as well.
And while the United States, Professor, has already immunized 50 million Americans, well, the Philippines is still waiting for its first vaccine to arrive. And what is arriving this Sunday is a Chinese vaccine that many Filipinos are hesitant to get inoculated with. What is the track record of Chinese vaccines with the US FDA?
Well, the experience of Chinese vaccines with the US FDA is perfect. It's zero. The US FDA has not reviewed any single vaccine ever manufactured in China because it hasn't been submitted. And you only have to suspect that the reason that's happened is because the data really isn't as good as the Chinese are making it out to be. Otherwise, why would you pass up a market such as the US? So I'm certainly quite suspicious. I hope that the Philippine government really takes a very hard look at the data that it is given by the Chinese, if it's given any data at all, before it makes its final decision.
Well, the Sinovac vaccine has already been given emergency use authorization here in the Philippines. That's why we're seeing about 600 doses arriving this weekend. And Sinopharm has been illegally used by government and legislative officials without even an EUA. In the US, if a vaccine is used without EUA approval, what are the repercussions?
Well, it's a crime and people can go to jail. That should not happen. We can't let greed and suspicion trump science. Science has to lead the day. And sometimes science doesn't tell you what you want to hear, but you can't ignore it. You've got to follow the facts, you've got to follow the data and make science-based decisions 100% of the time, and especially when it comes to something as serious as vaccinating a nation against COVID-19.
And if you take a look at the clinical trials of Sinovac, which has been given EUA status by the Philippine FDA, it has only a 50.38% efficacy. Tell me, Professor Pitts, if we get inoculated with the Sinovac with a 50.38% efficacy, can we get immunized by a Pfizer, a Moderna, or maybe an AstraZeneca 6 to 12 months later? Can we be immunized with another brand after we are inoculated with a vaccine that has a very low efficacy rate?
You know, there's really no data to say one way or the other. I would suspect that the answer is yes. But the real danger of getting initially vaccinated with a product that really is not effective is that people think they have immunity and they don't. And that's very dangerous because you don't want people to let down their guard, to stop social distancing, to take off their masks because they feel that a vaccine is getting the job done. You know, the Sinovac percentages, which again, I have not seen the statistics, no data has been provided to the West, you know, really puts, I think, everybody at risk for a very low efficacy rate. You know, the fear is there that it's not going to get the job done. Can people get vaccinated afterwards with a more effective vaccine? I would say yes. Data is still outstanding on that one.
So what is your advice to the Philippine Food and Drug Administration and how they should approve vaccines for EUA during these critical times?
You know, there's only one way to approve for an EUA or for an approval, which is entirely based on the science. Politics can play no role whatsoever. The Philippine FDA is a solid organization, does a great job. It recognizes the value of science, and it can't allow politics to influence its decision. We've had that same debate here in the US, and I think we've come out at the right end that science has to lead the day. That's really the headline. In fact, it's what we've got to follow. You have to follow the science, you have to follow the data. If you don't have it, you have to ask for it. If you don't get it, you should not issue an emergency use authorization.
Professor Peter Pitts, former FDA Associate Commissioner, joining us from New York. Thank you so much for your insights.